Welcome to the Legally Speaking podcast, powered by Kassoon Car. I'm your host, Rob Hanna. This week, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Johnny Shearman. Johnny is a professional support lawyer at Signature Litigation with expertise in all aspects of dispute resolution. Johnny was co-editor of the Chambers and Partners UK Litigation Global Practice Guide 2019 and recently co-authored the featured article on the Disclosure Pilot Scheme for PLC Magazine's 30th anniversary edition. Johnny has featured in numerous publications such as the FT Advisor, Dow Jones Financial News, Compliance Monitor, and many more. So a very big welcome, Johnny.
Thanks very much, Robert. Thanks for having me on. It makes me sound like I do a lot of writing, so I'm grateful.
Good stuff. Well, you made me have a bit of a mouthful on the introduction, so you definitely keep very busy. And as you'll know, I believe you're a fan of the show, which is great. Before we go through all of your amazing achievements and your experiences to date, we must start with our customary opening question, which is about Suits. So on the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very real, how real would you rate the TV series Suits?
I've been ready for this question for quite a while now, Robert. And, I am a fan of the show. And actually, just before I answer the icebreaker, let me just say, I think you guys are doing a great job in terms of championing the legal industry. And, I think this podcast is going from strength to strength. So it's really great to be on here. In terms of Suits, I think I've got to go with the majority here in terms of about 4. I have been a fan of Suits, and I think there is an element of truth in what they do. I know a lot of people say there isn't, but, a lot of law does actually happen late at night, not necessarily with a whiskey in hand. But also what I would say is got a cracking soundtrack. I mean, I give that 10 out of 10. The music on the show is absolutely brilliant. So there we go. I think in terms of legal reality, it's a 4, but in terms of the music, it's a 10.
Yeah, and I think you put that fantastically well. I'm also a big fan of the music. I had that on one of the quiz questions, really. When we went through the whole Zoom quizzing phase and they had a section on sort of theme tunes. And I obviously, as soon as I heard that, I was like, at least I'm going to get one of these questions right on the TV series theme tunes. So we have to start at the beginning, Johnny. So tell us a bit about your sort of family background and upbringing.
Sure. I'm the youngest of 5 children. So, it was a bit of a competitive upbringing, but also just kind of a very loving and supportive family, which I'm very lucky to have. And actually for me, I grew up in the countryside, went to a kind of local comprehensive school and was always kind of fascinated by science and nature, being outside and being in the garden. And actually that was always very much a focus for me growing up. And actually, I didn't enter law through a law degree. I went off and did a science degree in biology down at Plymouth University. And because that was actually very much my first interest, and it still is really, and I still absolutely love the sciences. But I did, kind of transition into law slightly later in my life.
Yeah, and maybe tell us then a bit about your legal experiences, sort of your training days, and tell us more about that.
Sure. So I trained and qualified with a firm called Nabarro, which is actually now merged into the huge kind of behemoth that it is in terms of CMS. And it was an absolutely fantastic kind of, training experience. And I was very fortunate for it. But when I came to doing the GDL and doing the DLPC, I actually didn't have any kind of experience in terms of training contracts. And I didn't even know what a training contract was, to be perfectly honest with you, Robert. And I was looking, and I finished my biology degree down at Plymouth and was looking at kind of, graduate entry jobs and, further training and master's degrees. And I actually, quite genuinely, I was living down in Devon at that time, and I was sat on my computer and I was looking on the Guardian website for jobs. And there was a little kind of banner on the side, which was from the College of Law as it was back then, which says, you can convert your degree to a law degree. And I thought, oh, wow, that sounds great. I'll do that. And not really appreciating kind of everything that was involved in that in terms of, funding, training contracts and so on. So when I then kind of rocked up to the College of Law later on that year to do my conversion, quite quickly felt like I was a bit out of depth. And actually one of the first things I did was to go to the careers center and kind of, ask them for some help. And that's what I needed. And I did get a mentor back then, just kind of give me a bit of insight into what was required. But also actually had an upfront conversation with the careers center kind of advisor. And they were kind of talking to me and, I've got a half decent degree in biology and they're saying, what kind of law firms do you want to kind of apply to? And I kind of knew enough to say that, maybe not the magic circle, maybe somewhere a bit below that. And quite genuinely, I was kind of saying, at that point, I'd be interested in taking up, environmental law. It just so happened that the careers advisor kind of knew that Nabarro had a bit of an environmental team. And so she said, what about Nabarro? And I've got to be honest with you, I just went, yes, I will get a training contract with them then. I didn't really think about it in any other way, apart from that, that sounded sensible to me. And again, I don't necessarily recommend this, but I was very focused on getting a training contract, with them. And I did very few training contract applications, but I made sure that the one that I did for Nabarro was pretty much the best thing that I've ever done in my life. And thankfully, I was successful in getting that. And I went for the vacation scheme and thankfully, obtained the training contract, through that. And actually, Nabarro was a great place to train. One of the things that I also was attracted to was the fact that they had a training contract which wasn't for 6 month seats, which is quite typical in law firms. It was actually 4 months seats. So you got to see more of the firm. And that was actually really important to me because, yes, I kind of came in with this slight environmental side to me, but I really didn't know at that point what area of law that I wanted to go into. And so I was very much kind of, an open book and ready to learn, really. And it just so happened that actually I ended up kind of, going into the litigation department. And I have to be honest with you, that was the last thing which I thought I was going to go into in terms of a legal practice. But actually, I absolutely loved it. And during my training, I was working both in the commercial litigation department, and also back then they were doing an element of clinical negligence work. They were on a panel for one of the large medical defence unions. And so we used to get a lot of work through that. And so that was defending doctors either through clinical negligence or through regulatory complaints that may have been brought against them. That was a really, really kind of, steep learning curve for me. I think when anybody that's in that line of work, knows that actually your caseload is very large, is quite demanding. And, I actually really kind of, learned to love litigation and dispute resolution. And for me, I think it does also come down to the fact that I think in many other practices of law, you know what the law is and you're working around it. But in litigation, new law can pop up at any point in time. When you get a new judgment coming out from the High Court, from the Court of Appeal, of the Supreme Court, you need to pay attention to that because that may well impact your case. And for me, that's really exciting and something which I love about this area of law.
Good stuff. And so you talk very fondly then of your training and then sort of getting into commercial litigation. And then obviously you then make a move. And so do you want to sort of tell us a bit about that decision-making process and then your next legal role? And then we can perhaps talk and an interesting fact for you, Johnny, your first PSL to come on to Legal Speaking Podcast. We're going to be drilling down into that a lot more shortly. But yeah, tell our listeners a bit more before that as well.
Sure. I'm keen to talk about the role because I think it's a really exciting role as well. And I did kind of move away from Nabarro, and actually it was a recognition of wanting to move more into the kind of commercial space. I found that the clinical negligence work had been absolutely fantastic in terms of experience, but I was doing then about 50-50 in terms of straight commercial litigation and clinical negligence work. And so I needed to kind of, move on to kind of, actually kind of broaden my experience. And at that point in time, Signature Litigation had been set up and it had been founded in 2012. And so I joined Signature Litigation in 2014. So still when it was very, very new, very, very novel and very, very young. At that point, there was only a handful of us in a small office space just off Fleet Street, although we're still near that area. I just thought that was a really exciting thing to be a part of, a new specialist law firm that had just kind of, set up. And, for me, I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as an entrepreneur, through and through. But I do think I've got an entrepreneurial spirit. And for me, it was very much kind of, aligned with Signature and what they're trying to achieve in this space. And perhaps I can just quickly say a bit more about Signature, because for me, what really resonates is I describe it as kind of, the three pillars of Signature. And they go to kind of, the service that we provide our clients, but also our culture as a firm. And the first pillar is we operate in a conflict-free space. And that's not new or novel necessarily. There are other firms that do that. And that largely came out of the 2008 financial crisis, when there was a lot of litigation going on in terms of work against banks. And, partners found themselves conflicted because their banking teams or so on were on a bank's panel, and therefore they couldn't come along and bring a claim against them. So, a number of kind of, specialist and boutique law firms were kind of set up, from that, who were operating on this conflict-free platform. But actually that does mean, a couple of things. I think it means that we get some really interesting work. It's actually never happened in terms of what I've seen in terms of an actual genuine conflict, has arisen. We may not act on something kind of strategically or so on. That means that, we can pretty much turn our kind of, focus on any matter. The next pillar that I kind of always talk about is actually how we operate in terms of the time that our kind of fee earners are actually kind of, dedicating to their work. And this kind of spins out from, our founding partner, who comes from a very large kind of, international multi-practice law firm. And actually he was finding that he was spending, perhaps 60% of his time on steering committees, management time, and very little on what he really wanted to do, which was to provide legal advice to his clients, which he had grown to have a very good and strong commercial relationship with. But actually he was being pulled in all these other directions. So the focus at Signature, and we're very management light, and we essentially have a symbiotic relationship and outsource our kind of management function. And what does that mean? It means that actually, the lawyers are there to do law. And that's not to say that they don't kind of have extracurricular activities and other focuses, but it means that actually when the client picks up the phone, they know they're going to speak to their lawyer. And I think that's a really important point to happen. For clients, that's what they want. They don't want to kind of, be passed around and saying your lawyer's in a management meeting. And then the final pillar, and I think this is really fundamental for me in terms of why, I was really attracted to Signature Litigation, was that we essentially operate on a kind of cooperative basis. And what do I mean by that? When Signature was first set up, the founding partners went with this idea to the SRA to say, we'd like to set up a law firm, which is essentially a cooperative, like your John Lewis model or your co-op, where each of the kind of members of the firm benefit from the profits and are invested in it. Now, the SRA didn't quite understand this. And so if you actually look at us in terms of, from the SRA's point of view, we're set up as a traditional LLP law firm with partners and equity partners and so on. But essentially what we built out underneath that is this co-op. So that means that, we don't just have traditionally, as you're probably aware, partners taking the vast majority of profits in terms of, the work that's done within the law firm. Those profits are actually shared amongst everyone. And when I say everyone, I mean, whether it's me as a PSL or associate team or even our PAs. And actually, if you were coming into our office, I'd say this to you then, actually the people that you see at the front of house, they're all invested in this cooperative. And for me, it just generates such a good culture in terms of being invested in the firm, invested in how we do and the service that we provide. And anyway, I think that's a really, really strong point for us. And I'm very proud to kind of talk about it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I think it's very unique, as you say, and I think it just encourages that whole collegiate culture. And yeah, I guess everyone is kind of moving towards the same goal, which is great. And just to sort of build on that then, you obviously had great fee earning days and you did decide then to sort of become a PSL. So for those that perhaps new to PSL, do you want to explain what it is and perhaps how that role differs from, say, an associate or a partner role?
Sure. So PSL, otherwise known as a professional sport lawyer, and if I'm honest with you, there's now a number of other names that this role kind of gets referred to as. So it might be knowledge lawyer or knowledge development lawyer or practice development lawyer, but essentially it's a non-fee earning role. So I'm not strictly working directly with our clients and on client matters. However, what I am providing is support to the rest of the team. And actually, my analogy to kind of explain it is the way I see it is that I'm very similar to what, say, a sports coach or even a football manager is doing. And so that's kind of, sitting back and kind of taking on all the information and kind of saying, actually, you need to be focused on, say, this recent judgment because that's going to help you on your case, or there's some new technology that we might want to use within the firm because I think that's going to help us improve our client service. And so it's kind of, I think that's a good way of describing it because it's kind of saying you've got to be kind of, across everything. It certainly gives me a lot more time because I think it's right that, fee earners are those elite athletes, as it were. They are the ones who are kind of laser focused on the work that they need to do. Again, it goes back to that point, but spending time with our clients and making sure that they get the advice that they want. But as I say, I think the professional support lawyer role is perhaps one step removed. But as I say, it's quite a good way of describing it is this kind of head coach way of thinking about it, because I think that it's about kind of picking out, I don't mean this literally, but I'm looking at kind of what nutrition and what tech we might want, or scouting out, what's the opposition doing? What do we need to pay attention to? So I think that's a good way of kind of describing the role.
Yeah, I think you've analysed that really, really well. And then I guess to encourage people to maybe consider a PSL role as an alternative to partnership, what would you say to those maybe who are quite new to a PSL role, considering it as an alternative to partnership?
What I'd say is that I think more generally, I think it's really important to kind of, consider all the options to you. I think it's very easy to get focused or get stuck on this trajectory to partnership. And that's completely fine if that's genuinely what you want to do. But I think one of the things that I recognized within myself was that I was involved in a race, which actually I didn't want to win. I didn't want to kind of, win the race and become a partner. And so I think it's really important for you to kind of, to step back and to kind of have a look and say, what race do I want to run? And ultimately, where do I want to take my career? And I think, PSL or knowledge lawyer is something which is going to be increasingly important. Law has changed over the past 10, 20, 30 years. We're not in a time where a letter would take 2 to 3 weeks and it would go out. We're talking much more demanding. And frankly, it's just not possible, I think, for any one individual to be on top of absolutely everything all at one time. And also then, deliver the kind of service that clients are expecting these days. If you're kind of thinking, actually, where does my skill set sit? And for me, I do think of myself as being much more academic. When I was fee earning, I always had a big stack of papers next to me of things I wanted to read, whether that's judgments or articles. And I just never got around to doing it. And that was partly because I was focused on fee earning work. But now, I'm afforded that luxury, as it were, to be able to read those articles and journals and indeed, contribute to those articles and journals myself. And I think that's an important point to be considering. Where do you want to kind of, see yourself in that next kind of, 5-10 years time? And I think, that transition, I think, can be through PSL. It's actually on law firm management. And I think that's something which, I certainly see myself kind of going into, but it's not necessarily a traditional partnership role. But it is a role in terms of, actually looking at how a law firm manages itself and what marginal gains can we get. Goes back to another sports analogy that in terms of, you're probably aware, Robert, in terms of marginal gains in British cycling that was achieved in 2012 London Olympics. But for me, that's, again, some really interesting concepts. But I wanted to kind of have the time to explore those different angles and the different aspects that I could kind of bring to law. And I think that's why it's important to kind of, keep open when you're going through your legal career and understand what your skill set is. If actually you're feeling that your skill set's being drawn to something else, then you should definitely investigate that and look at it more.
Yeah, good stuff. And you mentioned earlier around sort of the entrepreneurial flair. I wanted to talk a bit more about, because you are a founder and director of JD Legal. So do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So JD Legal is a company which I set up a year ago, which is my own company. And actually it provides some consultancy services to the legal industry and actually with a focus on the e-discovery industry. It's really around content and content generation. And actually it is something which I'm really kind of passionate about. And you and I have engaged a lot across LinkedIn. And I think that's a really important platform for all businesses to be using, not just lawyers. LinkedIn as a platform has changed dramatically over the last 2 or even 1 year, and it's a fantastic place for content. And so actually, JD Legal was something which I kind of set up as a bit of a side project. And again, I actually think it's a really valuable skills that you need to learn when you're setting up your own company, which again, I think often we miss when we're just going through law school and legal training. We set up a lot of companies for other people, or we're doing corporate deals for other companies. But there's a real insight that you gain when you're setting up your own company, when you're having to do your own invoicing, when you're having to chase for your own invoices. And that's a skill set which I wanted to gain. And I recognized that, I wasn't necessarily at a point in time where I could just jump into that in terms of a big international law firm. But I knew actually that I could generate something which was beneficial in terms of content and content marketing. It's been really good. I only have a very kind of small client base on that. And it's something which I just kind of keep ticking over. I find it hugely beneficial to me, and I think it will be hugely beneficial kind of going forward in terms of adding those skills to my quiver, because I think they're really valuable ones, whether you're a lawyer or just operating in the commercial sphere to have. And I think you get a lot more insight. You probably agree with me, Robert, as an owner of your own business. It's very different from just being an employee. And I think I wanted to understand that, and which is why I kind of did that as a bit of a side hustle, a bit of a side project. But thankfully, it's going very well.
I'm really pleased to hear that and completely echo what you're saying, because it is a slightly different ballgame having your own business. And again, I guess the beauty of the whole networking thing, great that you and I first connected via LinkedIn, because I think we both agree it's such a sort of valuable platform. And I know you've got a keen interest in the algorithm. And so I guess as we look to try and wrap up, what advice would you give to lawyers who perhaps want to use LinkedIn more but don't really know where to start? What tips would you give?
I actually think one of the best things that you can do is actually start to look at what other people are putting out in terms of content. And I actually think this doesn't necessarily just apply to LinkedIn, but it applies more generally. And I think especially for young lawyers and aspiring lawyers, I think it's really important just to kind of observe what others are doing. It's something which I have always done. I've kind of always looked at those people that are perhaps, 5, 10 years ahead of me in terms of their career and kind of gone, what are they doing? What are they talking about? And obviously now posting about. I think it's really important just to kind of gain that exposure, because then what you can then start to do is dip into that, and you can frankly just kind of copy it a bit and kind of see what they did and see what what you can add to it. And I think that is an important point. You do need to kind of add your own spin to it. You shouldn't worry about putting yourself out there. I mean, it is a big thing for people in terms of, are they going to get the likes? And frankly, you'll know just as well. You'll put out a post and you think it's the best post that, anyone's ever written. And just because of the timing that you did it, it doesn't go anywhere. And you just have to chalk that down and you just go, it doesn't matter. I'm going to do another post tomorrow. I'm going to do another post in the next couple of days. And you'll see where we get with that one. And I think you've got to be prepared to have a bit of fun with it. And yes, it is a professional platform, but I do think that people are much more ready to understand you as a person rather than just necessarily a corporate entity. So I think that's where you can have a bit of fun with it as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because sometimes it can get quite heavy, the working world. So I think it definitely is a great, fabulous, fantastic sort of professional networking site. And I think some of the content that you've been producing recently, Johnny, I've really enjoyed. So I definitely encourage our listeners to follow on you on that. And I guess as we wrap up, I'd just like to say a really big thank you for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure learning more about you, your journey, your entrepreneurial flair. So on behalf of all of us from the Legally Speaking podcast team, we wish you lots of continued success with your legal career and entrepreneurial suits. And from us, over and out.
Thanks so much for having me on.